Winter Danger by William O. Steele, Chapter 11. Caje made a neat bundle of his stockings and the piece of flannel. He laid it on the fireboard, and beside it he put all but 3 of the lead balls he'd found in his pouch. By the dim light of the fire, Caje wrapped the rabbit skins Jarrett had given him around his feet and tied his moccasins. He pulled his shirt tight about him and looked around the room once before he opened the door and silently slipped out. The stars were bright over his head. The cold was terrific. The air seared his hands. His teeth chattered a little as he hurried down the hill. At the foot he turned and looked back. He remembered the day he and Jared had come here. He'd had high hopes then of spending a winter under a snug roof with a warm fire and enough to eat, but he and Jared had brought their bad luck with them. It was a good thing he was leaving. Well, it was what he got for trying to be something that he wasn't. A woodsy was a woodsy. He couldn't be a farm boy. As long as he might have lived with the Tadlocks, he would always have been taking what he couldn't return. He set off through the poplar trees across the frozen creek. He hated to leave them just the same. They were good folks. Even Sam had been good to him. Maybe someday he'd come to see them and bring them skins and deer meat to pay for his stay with them. It was lighter now. The snow squeaked under his moccasins. He kept swapping his rifle from hand to hand so that he could warm his free hand in his shirt. Sam would be up by this time, feeding the horse and the heifer. Dorcas would be putting the ash cake on the hearth to bake. A covey of little birds scattered in front of him, dark specks on the snow. But as the pale sun rose higher in the sky, he began to doubt that he'd live to see it set, much less to see the rest of the winter. He found a slippery elm tree and slashed off long strips of the thick bark with his axe. He pulled off the slick white inner bark and ate it. It was better than parched corn for filling him up, but it didn't stick to his ribs for long. He stuffed some of the bark in his shirt. Halfway through the morning, his feet bothered him so much he stopped and took off his moccasins. His feet were bright red, and the veins stood out purple and thick along the tops and side of them. But his toes were turning white. He rubbed them gently for some time before he put his moccasins back on. Then he jumped up and down and stamped his feet to get some feeling back into them, but it did little good. He'd have to build a fire, he decided. He couldn't risk getting his toes frostbit the first day. He looked around for a sheltered place where he could make a fire. Something caught his eye, something that made him forget his feet for the moment. Halfway up a hillside, a little ledge of rock stuck out from the snow, and over it hung a little puff of white smoke. The puff drifted away, and another came to take its place. His hands trembled as he picked up his rifle. He knew what was up there. Many a time he'd heard Jared tell of hunting bear by the white puffs their breath made in the cold air over their dens. Quietly he made his way up the hillside. Jared always said a bear didn't sleep any sounder during his winter sleep than any other time. He'd have to be careful. Oh, he hoped it was a young bear, still fat. But even if it was an old one, tough and rank-tasting, it would keep him from starving. He knelt and swept the snow away from around the entrance to the den. The smell of bear, heavy and harsh, rose up around him. He checked his gun carefully. Faintly he could hear the beast's regular breathing. Picking up a fallen branch, he jabbed it into the hole and felt it ram into something solid. There was a growl from the den. Hastily, Caje stepped back, dropping the stick and raising his rifle. He heard a scuffling sound, and then the great brown face and little eyes of a bear peered from the hole, sticking almost straight out of the snow. Caje sighted down his rifle barrel at a spot right between the bear's eyes and pulled the trigger. The bear stared around at Caje for a minute, and then it slumped forward. Caje loaded his rifle. It was hard work, for his fingers were stiff and numb with cold. He poked at the great head with his foot, holding his rifle ready. The bear was dead. He set to work clearing away the debris at the den entrance. Finally, he had made enough room so that he could skin the bear. He was delighted to see it was a young one, fat and plenty big enough to feed 10 cages, big enough to feed a family. It was big enough to feed the Tadlocks. He stood there staring down at the brown, coarse fur. If he could get his bear back to the cabin, it would save the Tadlocks. It would save Martha and Uncle Adam and old Britt. It would feed them all for the 3 weeks until help came from Salisbury. He took off his moccasins and rubbed his feet up and down the bear's warm hide until the feeling came back in them and his toes began to tingle. The big body gave off almost as much heat as a fire. Then he began to skin the bear. Oh, he'd be glad to go back toting a bear ham and slabs of meat from over the ribs. Now he could pay his aunt and uncle back for all he'd eaten during the weeks he'd lived with them. He could leave in the spring. With warm weather, he could go off and they'd not be bothered with him again. He worked steadily, cutting up the meat. He made a crude sled of poles with traces of twisted elm bark. He loaded it with meat, as much as he could carry. The rest he wrapped in the bearskin. He tied this to a pole placed between 2 trees high off the ground. A panther might get to it, but not the wolves. He and Sam could come back for it later. He set out over the snow, pulling the load with the rough traces. He could hardly wait to get back to the cabin. He hoped they hadn't taken a notion to kill old Britt today. Wasn't it a lucky thing he hadn't run after Jared? He thought a minute about that as he slid down a hill toward a thicket of pines. Had he been meant to stay with the Tadlocks all winter, to live with them on charity, in idleness, so that now he could save them when they were nearly out of food and Uncle Adam sick? Did folks always get a chance to pay back favors if they waited long enough? He remembered Henry Renfro, who had helped Uncle Adam in the spring. He remembered how Jared had said he would have done without, rather than be beholden to a stranger. But Uncle Adam had paid Henry Renfro back. He'd sent meal when the Renfros were sick and all their meal was gone. He dragged the heavy sled load of meat up a hill and stood looking out over the snow-covered valley. He didn't see anything familiar, but he knew he was going in the right direction. Jared never liked taking favors from other people. He hated being beholden. But suddenly, Caje knew folks weren't really beholden to each other. You did what you could for other people, and when there was nothing you could do, sometimes you had to let others do for you. Folks had to get along with each other, and sometimes it meant doing, and sometimes it meant being done for. A boy had to learn to do one as well as the other. Jared would spend all his days in the woods because he'd never been able to let others do for him. He was always weighing and measuring, figuring how he'd have to pay back for every little thing done for him, always suspicious of everybody. Uncle Adam wasn't like that. He'd taken help from Henry Renfro when he'd needed help. But when he gave Henry meal, he hadn't reckoned it as paying Henry back. It was just his turn to be the helper. Uncle Adam and Aunt Jess wouldn't worry about taking from the Craigs, or from the men who were going to Salisbury, or from anybody. They knew they would do for anybody else in trouble, so they didn't mind taking when they had to. As he started down into the hollow, Caje knew the Tadlocks had never expected any return for what they'd given him. They'd taken care of him because they could, and because they wanted to. They wouldn't have begrudged him anything, even if he'd never been able to do anything for them. When he went back to the cabin, he'd be going home. The shadows were growing long. It had taken a good while to skin the bear and put the meat in the tree. He looked around anxiously. He'd never make it back before dark. Well, he'd journey as far as he could. He tried to hurry, but he was tired and the meat was heavy. He came to a lot of rough, drifted snow and had a hard time getting through. The cold blue light of evening settled over the hills, making strange shadows by every bush and tree. He turned and looked back, watching the light fade from the winter sky. What was that, running behind him in the dusk? Those long gray shapes with gleaming eyes. Wolves. Wolves were after him and the fresh meat.